Good morning. I should get this lesson down pretty pat because this is the second time I forgot to hit record when I did it the first time. I'm glad that you joined in today, and I hope that everybody has been enjoying a little bit of fall like weather this week. We're just in that orbit of our Earth around the sun that God's placed us there, and we don't have the direct rays of the sun, so our temperatures are a little bit cooler, and everything's just wonderful and crisp and clear. We're continuing our study in Isaiah in session 3 of the quarterly, or Isaiah chapter 7, if that's how you follow along. When God's people were led out of Egypt by Moses, and I'm going to review a little bit because it makes it coherent for me, not to insult any of you who are listening, but when they were led out of Egypt, they traveled and they wandered for a lot of years. But they weren't too different from us. They whined and they complained. When it's hot, we complain about it being hot. When it gets cold in the wintertime, we complain about it being cold. But they complained and they remembered the good old days when they were back in Egypt. Do you remember the good old days when you had an outhouse and maybe not hot water? Those good old days? Well, they were back in Egypt, and when they were there, they were slaves. But they had a tendency to forget about that. And they remembered that they were fed because they got hungry along the way here. But God provided their needs. But once they finally entered into the promised land, the land was divided among 12 tribes, and altogether they formed the nation of Israel. But after Solomon's death, the country was divided between the northern tribes, which was 10 of the 12, and Ephraim's tribe was the dominant one. So sometimes you might see the word Ephraim is referring to the northern part of Israel, which was also kept the name Israel. The southern part of the nation had only two tribes, Benjamin and Judah, so that part was known as Judah. Aram, which is Syria today, was a small country just to the north of the northern section, or the northern part of Israel. Assyria was a larger country more to the east of Israel, and it was at that time the dominant power of the world, politically, militarily, and it presented a threat to all of the smaller nations around it. The king of Aram, the other smaller nation, or Syria, Rezin was his name, and the king of Israel, Pekah, joined forces in hopes that they could protect their countries against this larger country of Assyria. But they wanted Ahaz, who was the king of Judah, the southern part of Israel after it was divided, to join in with their alliance. He refused to join with them, so both of those countries turned on him and on Judah, and their goal was to replace Ahaz and put in a puppet king who would follow their instructions and their leadership. Ahaz learned about this plan to invade Judah, and he and all of the people of Judah actually went into a state of distress. They were very afraid because there were two countries against one. And it was at this time that God sent Isaiah to Ahaz with his message. It was a message of encouragement, and that brings us to our first verses of today, which would be Isaiah chapter 7, verses 7 through 9. And it says, "Thus saith the Lord God, it shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. For the head of Aram, or Syria, is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years shall Ephraim," which is Israel, the northern part, "be broken, that it not be a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son, Pekah," that's the king there. "If you will not believe, surely ye shall not be established." Now Ahaz probably felt, and the people felt, that he and Judah were in a no-win situation. But through Isaiah, God said this coalition between Aram and Israel was not going to pose a threat to Judah. He said it will not happen. And Ahaz couldn't know it because we don't see the future, but God did. And those two countries that he feared were already in Assyria's sight. So Ahaz obviously knew the capital cities and their kings. He knew that the capital of Syria was Damascus. He knew that the capital of Ephraim was Samaria. He knew that, but when in naming them, through Isaiah, God was emphasizing his control over all of the nations, not just Judah, all of them. The capital city of Aram, Damascus, and of course the king was Rezin. Ephraim, or the northern kingdom Israel, had as its capital city Samaria, and its king was the son of Remaliah or Pekah. Isaiah's message was that in 65 years, and that's 65 years, within 65 years, northern Israel would not even exist, and Damascus, or Syria, Aram, that city, would also be destroyed. It didn't take long. 3 years later, Damascus was conquered, Rezin was put to death, and Israel lost control over a big portion of its territory. Samaria, the capital city, though, survived for about 10 more years, although it eventually fell to Assyria as well. And Isaiah warned Ahaz if they did not stand firm in their faith that Judah was going to fall. But Ahaz began to look for a political way out of the situation. Of course, God knew his thoughts, but he was not ready to give up on giving him a chance to trust and giving him and the people a chance to trust God. So he sent him another message. And that brings us to scriptures 10 through 13. Moreover, the Lord spake again unto Ahaz, saying, Ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. And he said, Hear ye now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men? But will ye weary my God also? The fact that God spoke again showed his merciful nature. Ahaz was given a second chance to trust God and to trust in his word that none of his fears were going to come to pass. God knows our tendency to want to solve our problems with methods in our control. We want to be in control. But at this time, Ahaz and Judah needed to trust God solely. God even offered to give Ahaz a sign, and not only to give him a sign, but any sign that Ahaz could imagine and name. And it didn't matter how deep, how high, how wide the sign, anything he could think of, God would give him a sign to prove that he could trust, that they could trust in God to provide their safety. But Ahaz had already made and executed his own plan. He had made a commitment to Assyria's king. He sent a large sum of silver and gold from the Lord's temple, no doubt, in Jerusalem to an attempt to buy their safety. He responded to Isaiah in a way that some other time and at some other situation would appear to be very righteous and pious. He said, no, he's not going to test the Lord. But what he was doing was refusing the gift of a sign being offered because he was trying to cover up his own sin of untrust. If he would have named and accepted a sign from God, God would have given it to him, and then there would have been no need, no reason for him to put his trust in anything other than God's protection from Assyria. The people of Judah would have known that they were safe as well. And Isaiah saw right through his pretense and gave him a stern reprimand. God had promised years before to King David that his ancestors, the lineage of Judah, would continue to reign over his kingdom forever. And Ahaz was one of those descendants. Ahaz didn't have a good track record for listening to God's prophets, so Isaiah at this time was pretty frustrated and tired of dealing with him. But he said, what's worse? The worst situation is you're making me tired, but the worst is that you are exhausting God's patience. Ahaz refused to accept God's sign to prove his plan for saving Judah, so God said, well, I'm going to give you a sign anyway. And the next scriptures explain the sign that God would send in verses 14 through 17. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. God's judgment, it is prophesied, is to come at the hands of Assyria. The Lord shall bring unto thee and upon thy people and upon thy father's house days that have not come from the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria. The prophecy of this child that would be born of a virgin was given now in Isaiah, but it was also quoted in Matthew in the New Testament. At the time of this promise that it was given here by Isaiah, but also at the time that Matthew repeated the promise, Jewish people were facing a threat from foreign powers. At both times, the people wondered if God would protect them. At both times, the leaders were tempted to rely on their own plans to assure their future. At both times, God indicated that he was in control. And at both times, it was told that the child would be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. Ahaz and the people of Judah needed to realize that God was with them and they could trust him for protection against Assyria, also from Aram and Israel. Since the fulfillment of that promise, with the birth of Jesus, the world needs to realize that God is still with us and he is still trustworthy in all situations. Butter and honey was the staple food of the poor, which indicated that this child would also experience and understand the hardships of his people. Isaiah used the growth of a child to give a time frame for the fall of the nations, the nations that Ahaz feared so much. And that would be the ones he tried to pay off Assyria to protect him and his country instead of trusting God. Isaiah said, by the time a child could eat more solid food, when he could reject what was good and choose what was, when he could reject what was bad and choose what is good, meaning 2 to 4 years, the threat from the northern kingdoms would be totally eliminated. Because Ahaz had refused to trust God, his covenant people in Judah would experience disaster to the extent that nation had not seen in almost 200 years, when the country of Israel was divided between the northern and the southern tribes, meaning when Ephraim departed. The one that Ahaz put his trust in, Assyria, was promised that he would become the punisher of the Judah for turning away from God. Today's lesson focuses on the sovereignty of God and the trust that his people can place on his promises of deliverance, but also the promise that God will not allow his people to live in disobedience without facing his disciplinary judgment. On a personal level, we need to stop and evaluate our responses to problems that come up in our lives. Are we busy trying to be our own problem solvers and not even asking and trusting in God? Or are we just devising our own solutions? I want to thank you for joining in again this week, and I ask that you please remember Miss Joyce Lookabill's family, Wendy Turbeville and Chris Nance, and their other family members. She's no longer with us. We're going to miss her smile. She was always smiling when she went into the choir and went into the Sunday school class, and we're really going to miss her spirit in our church. After this week's lesson and how God reacted to the countries, it becomes more clear that we need to earnestly pray for our nation and its leaders. And I pray that we'll all stay safe. You'll stay safe, and that you'll help keep others safe, and that you'll have another great week with some wonderful fall weather. Thank you.